Hi, and welcome to the Psych, Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Van Schie, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
Well, we had a nice birthday party on the weekend.
Yep.
So that was a positive.
Did the cake turn out okay?
The cake did turn out okay. Yeah. I made a couple of like cake pillar type things that were a little bit wonky, but that's okay.
Yeah. And you survived. Was it mini putt-putt?
Mini golf. Yeah. Glow in the dark mini golf. Yeah. So that was interesting with 13 sort of children aged between 5 and 8.
Yep.
Yeah, the lady gave me a scoring card. I'm like, really? I'm not doing that.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of effort.
Well, especially because some of them were literally just like pushing the ball around the course with the whatever it's called, club. The putter. Yeah. But yeah, no, it was good. 90 minutes and it was over and done with, and I had food and all of that there, and then I left them to clean up the mess afterwards, which is the great thing about outsourcing a birthday party.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. For any parents out there, you're crazy if you host your own parties these days. There are so many places that do it, put on all the food and do the cleaning and everything.
Yep. It's much, much better.
Yeah, for sure. Well, glad that the party went well. I know some other things aren't going so well, but we've got 4 podcasts that we're recording this week. So we'll have plenty of time to get into those other things.
Listeners, you're just going to have to wait for the next episode. I know it's going to be hard for the latest installment of Joelle's Stupid Life.
Yeah, that's right. But the party went well.
Yes.
That's good. Well, look, allow me to introduce our guest for today. She's based in the United Kingdom and has been an active voice campaigning for mental health over the past 15 years. She's a key driver behind the Business and the Community report, What If Your Job Was Good For You?, where one of the stated aims is to gain parity between physical health and safety and psychological health and safety. Welcome to the podcast, Louise Aston.
Thank you, Jason. I'm delighted to be here. So thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks so much. We were able to make the time zone difference work okay. West Coast WA and London time isn't too bad. So glad that we've got you early in the morning while you're fresh.
All right, Louise, can you tell us about your professional career to date? You've got a bit of a different background to a lot of our guests, so it should be interesting for our listeners to hear all about that.
Yeah, of course. My background's actually creative. I trained as a textile designer and became a fashion buyer for a leading UK high street retailer. There is some kind of logic though in terms of my career progression. So I transitioned into campaigning by taking health into fashion, working with the National Radiological Protection Board to create a new British standard for UV fabric protection. And I designed a protective kids swimwear collection for the government's award-winning skin cancer prevention campaign called Sun Know How. And actually, we took a lot of lessons from an Australian campaign called, I think it was something like Slip, Slap, Slop or something. So this initiative resulted in lucrative licensing deals with high street retailers, which actually helped fund the campaign. So having got the campaigning bug, I moved on to become creative director at the government's marketing and communications agency. And I used a similar campaigning model to Sun Know How to translate government policy into a consumer-friendly marketing opportunity to create a mass market to encourage consumers to eat more fruit and veg, obviously to reduce the risk of heart disease, strokes and cancer. So I developed the 5-a-day campaign, which included developing a portion standard and identifying actually what fruit and veg actually counted, along with creating generic marketing collateral that food suppliers and retailers could bespoke to suit their individual brands. I also led Frank, the government's rebranding of the UK's National Drugs Helpline. And the campaign was really quite revolutionary because it marked a massive break from the traditional kind of preachy government, just say no to drugs. It was a cross-departmental campaign, and it took a really refreshing new approach that recognised people do and will take drugs. And the aim was to enable people to make informed decisions while looking out for their friends and loved ones. So the campaign model utilised a social marketing model and was primarily led from the ground upwards rather than top down. The big turning point in my career was when my brother was sadly diagnosed with schizophrenia. So I hadn't really thought about the impact of how poor mental health could have on so many people. And I was appalled by the stigma and discrimination around mental health. And because of this, I got involved in campaigning in the first UK's government's anti-stigma campaign, World Mental Health Day. So back in 1992, the media were able to get away with really cruel, stigmatizing headlines like axe-wielding nutter, which thankfully things have significantly moved forward, and that now there's absolutely no way that the media would get away with this kind of headline. So although mental health awareness has risen in the last 20 years, this hasn't translated into tackling the systemic root causes of poor mental health. And we know that mental health and safety, psychological safety, whatever you want to call it, lags way behind physical mental health and safety, and perhaps is where, I don't know, physical health and safety was maybe 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's a really interesting career progression there from fashion through to campaigning for mental health. So
they're quite logical.
It makes sense. Yep, absolutely makes sense. Yeah, it's sort of moving, from designing health supportive clothing through to then campaigning and then into mental health. And I think, for a lot of us that story of having a friend or relative go through a mental health crisis can be quite a turning point in our career. And when we, sort of see firsthand the impact that can have on so many different lives, it's definitely a motivating factor for a lot of us. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about business in the community then, and the Wellbeing campaign that you've got there.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons basically working for a business-led charity is to do with my private sector experience, but also the fact that I've also been a civil servant. So I understand kind of policy, commercial, but also working with a very broad and wide collection of stakeholders. So business in the community, for those of you who haven't heard of us, is the largest and longest established business-led membership organisation dedicated to responsible business. And we were founded by the Prince of Wales 40 years ago. In fact, we've got our 40th birthday coming up next year. So we work with literally hundreds of members who are mainly large corporates to continually improve responsible business practice, leveraging their collective impact for the benefit of communities and society at large. So our Bible, if you like, is our responsible business map, which is aligned to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals and is absolutely central to everything we campaign about, which is all about collectively creating greater impact. So I lead our Wellbeing campaign, and we look at employee health and wellbeing through the multiple intersectional lenses of diversity and inclusion, employment and skills, and most recently, which is really coming to the fore is through an environmental lens. Particularly, we know that there's plenty of evidence now to support the fact that connecting with nature, biophilic design are beneficial to physical and mental health and productivity. So I lead our campaign supported by a leadership of 15 business execs from a really wide range of sectors, including banking, construction, engineering, professional services, utilities, healthcare, logistics, and consumer goods. So really, the kind of purpose of our campaign is to build a movement that is committed to positioning health and well-being as strategic boardroom issues, and with a particular focus on mental health, driving collective action through evidence-based practical solutions. So we also have an extensive wellbeing champion network consisting of senior practitioners. So really, what the campaign is about is by business, for business. It's a business-to-business campaign, and it's all around kind of learning from each other to create collective impact.
Yeah, that's really great that you've got so many leaders, business leaders, who are contributing to that. One of the things that we're really interested in, and actually will be the subject of our next live panel in September, is on gaining top management support and board support for workplace mental health initiatives. We have found that whilst there's heaps of reports on ROI, and we'll talk a little bit about the statistics that have come out of the UK that are mentioned in your report in a moment, we're finding that isn't really moving the needle, and we need to move to more sustainability and looking at social impact in particular, because that's one of the things that is on the board's agendas at the moment. Have you found the same in the conversations that you've had with business leaders in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, I think it also really comes back to people want purpose, and at the heart of kind of leadership, but also what employees themselves want, is about purpose-led jobs. And in terms of jobs with meaning, that is much more than just about the bottom line. So in terms of ESG reporting and also kind of investor kind of interest in terms of what organisations are doing, that's really rising up the agenda here in the UK.
Yeah, because it's all about how we care for our people, right? And it's not just about doing the things that are kind of tokenistic, like the fruit bowls and yoga, but investors and shareholders are really interested now in what are people doing to give people good work, not just any work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So in June, Business in the Community released a report titled "What If Your Job Was Good for You?" I had a good read of that report, which is why I reached out to you, because I thought, hey, this is actually exactly what we're trying to get across in our podcast. So what drove Business in the Community to commission that report?
Gosh, so before the pandemic is basically, to give you a bit of context, the spine of Business in the Community's Wellbeing Campaign is something called the Mental Health at Work Commitment, which is actually relevant to any organisation in any country, which offers all organisations, wherever they are on their journey, to make a public declaration of putting mental health at the heart of their organisation. So the commitment's underpinned by 6 evidence-based standards, from something called the Thriving at Work report, which was an independent review commissioned by the UK Prime Minister back in 2017 about how to improve mental health and well-being at work. And before the kind of pandemic, is standard 2 out of those 6 standards of the commitment was deemed the most challenging of those 6 standards. And that standard 2 is proactively ensure work design and organisational culture drive positive mental health outcomes. Obviously, with the pandemic, overnight, it changed the nature and place of work for many of us. And basically, we strongly believe that we have a once in a lifetime opportunity to kind of pause, reflect, reset, to reimagine ways of working that transform mental health and well-being at work, which really tackle those systemic root causes of poor mental health. So for the past 4 years, Business in the Community's commissioned an annual statistically valid national mental health at work survey. And year on year, we were seeing that the percentage of employees, which were 41% in 2020, who have experienced poor mental health symptoms caused or worsened by work in the past year, was steadily rising. So can you imagine how entirely unacceptable it would be if nearly half your employees had experienced physical harm from work in the past year? So this comparison really resonated with our wellbeing leadership team, who felt really strongly that why should we tolerate employees having their mental health negatively impacted, when obviously you'd never get away with that if it was physically injuring your people. So we strongly believe that there shouldn't be a dichotomy between physical and mental health and safety, and that risks and hazards should be managed in the same way. And we know we really want that all employers should feel safe to call out all risks and hazards to mental health and be actively listened to without fear of negative repercussions or discrimination. So in other words, I guess it's about operationalizing psychological safety. And at Business in the Community, we talk about mental health and safety because there's no generic, well-established definition of psychological safety, which means different things to different people. And I can speak from experience that many business leaders that I mix with, they find the term psychological safety kind of what they say is too medicalized. So although work is part of the cause of poor mental health, we also know that it's part of the solution. And for far too long, organizations have focused on kind of reactive measures to attempt to tackle mental health and well-being. So as you just said, Jason, focusing on the kind of low-hanging fruits like awareness training, yoga, or free fruit. So basically, the kind of pandemic really has offered that kind of once in a lifetime opportunity. And we know that there's a large body of research that indicates that levels of mental ill health at work are influenced by more fundamental aspects of job design. So working from home and hybrid working have created opportunities for taking a more inclusive and individual approach that has the potential of enabling people to potentially co-create their own good jobs. And frankly, if we don't fundamentally think about how we design good jobs and good work, looking at the drivers of poor mental health and tackling them, we aren't going to see a significant shift in levels of mental ill health at work.
Yeah, it's going to be a real mind shift, isn't it, for leaders in businesses? Like you say, they still have this perception that psychological health and safety is medicalized. But as you say, if they just apply the same sort of hazard model like we do have for physical hazards and applying the same sort of health and safety lens to these hazards, then really we can see it's actually about the design of work, just like we design physically healthy and safe work environments. We can design psychologically healthy and safe work environments as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you mentioned the ongoing research and sort of data collection that business in the community has been running. And you mentioned some statistics there around sort of 41% of people are reporting that they're experiencing psychological distress associated with work. Can you take us through some of the other statistics in the report and explain why they're important?
Yeah, so in terms of informing the report is our research partner, Affinity Health at Work. They did a comprehensive literature review, and that accompanies the report on our website. We also used qualitative research from our 2020 Mental Health at Work YouGov survey, and we also conducted a series of qual interviews with our leadership team and stakeholders. So in the report, and obviously informed by extensive research, is we know that kind of during the pandemic, it's that more people have experienced poor mental health than ever before. So nearly 4/5, that's 79% of respondents, have reported some form of stress-related absence in the past year. And clearly we're not there in providing good jobs for all our people. And just picking up on that 41% that I've mentioned before of employees who developed a mental health issue due to work in the past year, the leading causes were excessive pressure and long working hours, which have increased by up to 12.5 hours per week in the past year. And really shockingly, of those employees that did disclose a mental health issue, 12% were subsequently sacked, forced out, demoted against their will, passed over for promotion, or subject to disciplinary action. So basically, you can't manage what you can't talk about, and just 56% of employees feel comfortable about talking about mental health at work. So clearly we've got a long way in terms of reducing that stigma. And then again, only 17% of employees with mental health issues disclose them to their line manager or HR. And this is, I guess, perhaps unsurprising, given that less than half of managers, that's 43%, have been given any training on how to manage staff with mental ill health. So I would say that there's a real quick win there in terms of actually providing training for managers. And we know that only 38% of employers think that their line managers have the confidence to have sensitive discussions and signposts to help if needed. So again, what really comes out in the report is that actually there has been a positive legacy of the pandemic, which there's been an increase in awareness of the importance of addressing and reducing mental ill health. We've seen at every level of society, the threat to mental health has been discussed and prioritised. And this has really translated into more organisations showing commitment to mental health and well-being than ever before. And I guess this is sort of manifested in the good news that 71%, up from 61% from last year, of employees believe that senior leaders now have employee well-being on their agenda. And there's been a significant leap in the percentage of employers who feel that their organisation promotes good mental well-being, and that's up significantly from 58% last year up to 77%. And the other bit of good news is there's also been a significant fall in organisations being more reactive than proactive. So that's basically now at 27%, down from 41% last year. So what we've really seen from the kind of research is that the pandemic demonstrated that job redesign can be achieved and achieved quickly, and organisational change intervention that could have taken years were literally actioned in days. So working from home at scale, previously seen as impossible for many roles, has become the standard mode of work for many. So as we transition, hopefully, out of the pandemic, there's the opportunity to embrace change and strive to create better jobs for everyone. And obviously, in terms of the benefits, will result in increased productivity, retention, resilience, and well-being of our employers, but also benefits for wider society and hopefully productivity.
So some good news in those statistics as well, which is great to hear, that companies are starting to head in the right direction and starting to give the right messaging to their organisations. I think the point about, supervisors being adequately prepared and able to manage employees who do have mental health issues is an important one. If we look at Australian statistics, in any 12-month period, 20% of the adult population is going to be diagnosed with a psychological illness, and over the lifetime, 50%. So, if you're a line manager, the odds are that you will have people in your team with a mental health issue periodically throughout your career. So it is an issue that you need to be across, and you need to be competent, and you need to know how to manage it effectively and with empathy.
Interestingly as well, all the statistics in the report obviously were pre-pandemic, but as you say, the pandemic has really brought mental health to the forefront. And then we have, recent things from the Olympic Games like Simone Biles and whatnot. And, people are really interested in what can be done around workplace mental health, and this intersection between, what we do and the impact that it has. So mental health is not just and no longer just a genetic thing or a weakness. It is, the circumstances that we're in can definitely play on our ability to remain mentally healthy. One thing I'm interested in, Louise, is the report references the Workwell model. Can you describe that for us?
I love our Workwell model. So when I first joined business in the community, kind of well-being was always positioned as a bit of an add-on, a kind of fluffy, nice to have thing sort of over here somewhere. And I worked with an expert steering group to develop the evidence-based Workwell model, which is a biopsychosocial model which positions employee health and well-being as strategic boardroom issues linked to securing business objectives. So in the context of responsible business, the aim of the Workwell model is to help businesses create environments where individuals and organizations can be at their best by taking a preventative, whole person, whole organization approach to embedding health and well-being into organizational culture. So at the center of this circular model is leadership, which is surrounded by 4 elements, which are better health and well-being, which is very much about looking at health and well-being through physical, mental, social, and financial kind of lenses. Then better work, better management, and better specialist support. And then there's 2 circular bands that go round those elements, which is about inclusive culture and collaboration with stakeholders, which obviously encompasses all of those elements.
Sounds a bit similar to the risk management model, where you got leadership in the middle and consultation and inclusiveness around the outside. Tell us a bit more about the better work element. So the second part of that inner bit, what's that all about?
So basically, to do with the what if your job was good for you report that we mentioned, that report actually implements the better work element of the model. So the better work element is part of the integrated approach to health and well-being. So obviously we know that jobs that are good for employees will promote and protect mental health, and they're defined as the better work component of the Workwell model, involving 3 elements. So you can actually find the Workwell model online if you just Google it. So the 3 elements are good work, job design, and psychological safety. So good work is where employees feel valued and appreciated for the work that they do, and that they're paid fairly and their work has meaning and purpose. What we mean by good job design means jobs that provide employees with autonomy over how, when, and where they do their job, have reasonable demands placed on them in order that they have a balance between work and home, and are supported and enjoy good relationships with their peers and colleagues, and they're clear about what they're there to do and are able to develop and grow in their role. And what we're calling mental health and safety, but call it psychological safety, is how we define that, is where employees feel safe to be able to speak up and be listened to without fear of reprisal for disclosing a mental health issue or making a mistake. A culture where employees have a voice and a place at the table and can perform at their best.
Yeah, so sounds very well aligned to the integrated workplace mental health model, popularised, I guess, by Tony LaMontagne, where we have the prevent harm, mitigate illness, and promote flourishing. So what you're talking about is, we know that there are aspects of work that are good for everyone. We should promote that because that will help people to flourish and achieve optimal wellbeing. We should have good work design so that we are able to prevent harm. So that includes, I noticed you mentioned a bunch of things out of there from the management standard from the HSC. And then, we need psychological safety to be able to speak up if we do have a mental illness and not be, held back or feel like we're being compromised because we have disclosed a mental illness to our employer. So how can organisations, in your opinion, achieve that better work element with that integrated kind of approach?
Well, that's really the crux of the report, Jason. So basically, in the What If Your Job Was Good For You report, is we've developed an evidence-based framework, which is about implementing that better work element of the Workwell model, but it's also a framework for high performance. And basically it sets out 5 enablers to achieve better work. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but because you can find it in the report, but the 5 enablers are around open dialogue and feedback. The second is around a collaborative, individual focused approach. The third is about focus on relationships, particularly managers. And the fourth is around appropriate physical environment. And the fifth is around measuring and monitoring. And underpinning those enablers are 4 values, which are empathy and compassion, inclusivity and equity, trust and appreciation, and authenticity. And at the beginning, we touched a bit around kind of sustainability, and underpinning both the enablers and the values is the driver of sustainability. And, obviously from where we're coming from, a healthy business is a responsible business. And we absolutely see the prosperity of business and society as being inextricably linked. So it's all about kind of making good jobs a reality, is thinking about sustainable kind of well-being and mental health outcomes.
Yeah, I think sustainability is key, as we mentioned earlier in this podcast. I think that's something that boards are really interested in at the moment. And as you say, healthy businesses are good businesses, and that's what investors are looking for and shareholders expect these days of their boards, to make sure that they have that in place.
So I guess demonstrating sustainability comes around to those issues of measuring and monitoring and taking action. Can you give us some ideas of what sorts of things organisations should be measuring and monitoring?
Yeah, again, in the report, there is a section on measurement, and I think really the kind of one size doesn't fit all, and there isn't one set of metrics that's right for everyone. And what you have on your dashboard will be dependent on your organisational culture and context. And I think really it's really important to consult your employees around the best metrics to work with, for instance, developing KPIs at a local level. In terms of some kind of broad steer around what good practice around measurement involves, is we talk about creating a plan for measurement and monitoring of health and well-being with clear accountability and feedback at each level of the organisation, in the same way as you would for physical health risk, ensuring that it's reviewed at a senior level. And obviously, ideally, it's about working towards publicly reporting your mental health data. We also talk about looking at your productivity metrics through a wellbeing lens. So consider the extent to which you take an output-focused approach, holding your employees accountable for what they deliver rather than the hours of work that gets done. And is this knowledge aligned to your productivity metrics? So we know that almost all organisations measure absence and most have a staff survey, but how is, for instance, excessive workload managed? And for many organisations, I don't think it is. So it's also about considering measures to capture strengths in the organisation, such as well-being and engagement, and how to build on those positives. But the really thing that I'm having a lot of discussion with, businesses with, is how do you measure psychological safety? And there's a lot of debate and discussion going on about that at the moment, and I'm not sure that anyone's cracked it yet.
Yeah, the psychological safety one is a bit of a trendy thing to be talking about at the moment, I guess. And as with lots of psychological concepts that then become part of the popular vernacular, I think that it can lose some of its academic rigor in the way that it's understood and operationalized in organizations. So that's an interesting one for companies to be grappling with. And I think it's important to find somebody competent to go back and actually look at the source research in the area before you start going down any pathways with that, and try to avoid some of the pop psychology interpretations of it.
Yeah, because organizational justice, organizational culture, just culture, procedural fairness, procedural justice, reporting culture, these are all things that have been abundant in safety literature in the past. Psychological safety, you could say, falls under a few of those different banners. But it's just gotten a resurgence thanks to, I don't know, some authors who've put out books recently.
Yeah. And I guess some people who liked them.
Yeah. I can understand this. It must be good.
Yeah. All right. So we've talked about measuring and monitoring. What about actions? Are there particular actions or guidance on actions that you can suggest for organisations?
Well, in terms of kind of high-level guidance, I've sort of attempted to cover them off just then. I would like to shine a spotlight on a great case study then. So with What If Your Job Was Good For You is we have a library of case studies and videos. And if you watch the Santander video, it's called Everyday Inclusion, and they are really great on measurement. So you'll hear Damien Scheiber, who's head of inclusion and wellbeing at Santander, talk about his dashboard. So they have in place a monthly wellbeing dashboard, which shows Santander the key wellbeing metrics across the organisation. And the dashboard takes into account preventable measures and interventions and looks at mental health absence across the organisation. It also helps Santander to understand the sentiment of employee wellbeing, as well as the uptake of their key initiatives, so that they can identify focus areas for improvement. So they recognise the really importance of listening to their people, and they run absolutely regular pulse surveys to give colleagues a chance to tell them in their own words how they can best be supported and where they're doing things well and where they can improve support. And then they utilize this data to create an action plan that informs initiatives and interventions that will be most impactful. So do watch that video. It's just a really nice, comprehensive case study.
Yeah, I do. I like that the report does have a number of different case studies in there, and I think it's useful to have that sort of examples of practice that people can look to and draw from. I think sometimes people can look at what a company like Santander has done and go, okay, we'll just take that and apply it in our company, and we will have the same success. And I would probably advise against that. Every company is unique. It's developed in its own way. It's got its own culture. And so you need to, I think, collaborate with your workforce to design a strategy and an approach that's actually going to be fit for purpose for your organisation, that's going to align with your values and your history. So yeah, it's good to, I guess, learn from what other people have done and take away good ideas. But we shouldn't be trying to just take a program that somebody else has developed and implement it as is.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, if you look at the ISO 45003 standard, the first thing you need to do is understand the context of the organization. Yep. So standards like 45003 give us kind of like a guide on how we can adopt a psychologically healthy and safety management system. But we need to make sure that we understand the intricacies of our own workplace. Yeah. Now, Louise, the report identifies 2 calls to action for business. I really like how it distills it down to the 2. I'm a bit of an abstract reader myself rather than reading the whole journal article. So I think this is really important. So what is the nitty gritty? Can you share these 2 calls to action with our listeners?
Yeah, so as I explained, at the heart of our campaign, it's around reducing that 41% of employees whose mental health has been negatively impacted by work or job design. So the first call to action is achieve parity between the management of physical health and safety and mental health and safety with an open and accountable culture. So that's going back to what I was talking about, that there should be no dichotomy between mental health and safety and physical health and safety, and that actually employees should feel safe to speak up about risks or hazards for themselves or be looking out for their colleagues as well. The second call to action is actually, again, in terms of the transformation of ways of working since the pandemic, is enable employees to co-create their own good jobs, supported by managers and aligned with organisational practices and policies. And obviously people can't just go off and, design their own good jobs in isolation. It's got to actually think about how it's going to work with the rest of the organisation, members of their team. So there's a lot to take into account, and particularly the relationship and the discussion with line managers. But I think, during the pandemic, there has been a lot more trust that has been generated by, in terms of employers seeing that, in a lot of cases, people can be trusted to work from home. So it's not, I think there was the expression is shirking from home rather than working from home.
Yeah. The first one of those calls to action was the reason in particular why the reports stood out for me and why I contacted you, Louise, around, elevating psychological health and safety to the same level as physical health and safety. I know you hadn't seen it beforehand, so it was quite interesting that you came up with this on your own or as part of the business and the community reporting process, because our Productivity Commission here in Australia, when looking at the economic impact of poor mental health in the whole economy, not just in businesses, out of all of the different reforms that they had or suggested reforms, they had 5 key reforms. And one of them is exactly the same conclusion that you came up with your colleagues, which was to elevate psychological health and safety to that same level as physical health and safety. So it's interesting to see, on opposite sides of the world, that people are coming to the same conclusions about this need to take more of a systematic health and safety lens to mental health at work rather than, I guess, the individual symptoms focused approach, which is popular.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you've used a term there, co-creation of jobs, and for those organizational psychologists who are listening, we might know that also as job crafting. So that's typically what it's referred to in the organizational development or design literature. And I really love hearing those sort of the anecdotal examples of, the cleaner working at NASA who, when the president asked him what his job was, he said, well, I'm helping to send man to the moon. And that's a great example of that sort of job crafting or co-creation and, the way that you frame the work that you're doing and what it contributes to. Can you give us any examples of how this can be achieved, especially in large bureaucracies?
Oh, wow. We're still on a journey, and, we've got, quite a bumpy road ahead in terms of as we travel into a new era of ways of working. And again, I can't give you some neat solution or some model case study because we're still in the kind of test and learn phase of this. And just for your listeners, is just to say is that in terms of what if your job was good for you, part 2 will be coming out in June in 2022, when we have got more of those insights and lessons learned. I mean, at the moment, in terms of that co-creation, as I said, I can't give you some really great case studies. One case study, one anecdote I can give you is I do a lot of work with Royal Mail Group. And, so there were a lot of business leaders saying, actually, people who have jobs in kind of who are key workers or frontline, where can you actually get flexibility on that? And, even as a postman at Royal Mail Group, there's still a degree of flexibility in terms of delivering letters. So it's not confined just to co-creating one's own good job if you're a kind of knowledge worker. I think it can go beyond that. But I do think there's something really exciting in terms of co-creating your own good job, in terms of, the sky's the limit if we can get this right. And a lot of this is about trust, but don't have all the solutions, but look out for part 2 of What If Your Job Was Good For You, June 2022.
An excellent plug.
Yeah, a lot can happen in a year though.
Indeed.
So, but yeah, that job crafting one's interesting. You did mention earlier in this discussion around the important role of the line manager, being able to have those discussions and find those opportunities with workers to job craft. So that's something that I think is a real competence gap at the moment, where first of all, leaders don't necessarily know what psychological factors or what work is good for people, right? You mentioned, some of the things before around role clarity and around, chances for growth and progression and all these sorts of things. And I don't think they're necessarily the conversations that line managers are having during performance discussions or regular discussions with their workers. So just by building that competence and the ability to have those discussions and finding, creative opportunities, like you said, you've been able to do at Royal Mail, to job craft, would go a long way to protecting people's mental health and wellbeing in the workplace.
Well, just imagine if your annual performance review was about job crafting and, what are the hazards that you're needing to deal with, and how can you work with your manager to address some of those hazards. Wouldn't that be a hell of a performance review?
Oh, it's something I've been dreaming about for a while, Joel.
Literally dreaming.
Yeah, well, I'm not that creative, I guess. I dream about my work. So, but I think there will come a time. I think we have to understand. I mean, we give our leaders, and this speaks to the report's call to actions as well. We give our leaders so much coaching around physical health and safety and the things that they need to be vigilant of, and how to keep their workers physically safe during the working day. They need to understand what they can do to keep their workers psychologically safe. And so they need to get these psychological factors into their vernacular and start to build that into their regular discussions that they're having with their employees. And one of the other things I guess we haven't spoken about so much in this discussion so far is asking employees for their feedback rather than waiting until someone's become ill because of their working experience. How about we periodically, whether it's one-on-one during those performance discussions or through the employee survey or pulse checks, as you mentioned, one of those companies that you mentioned regularly did the pulse checks and created action plans on the back of that. Let's ask rather than wait for someone to tell us that things aren't going well. But it's been a fantastic discussion so far, Louise. You've obviously been campaigning for quite a while in the UK. You've seen the changing nature with how mental health has been perceived by workplaces in particular, and how that's kind of changing. So looking into your crystal ball, what are your hopes for the future of workplace mental health in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, I've been campaigning on mental health for a long time. And, basically, in the last 10 years, awareness has really risen, but it wasn't translating into tackling those systemic root causes. And I think that it's taken a pandemic for mental health and well-being to really become the key boardroom issue along with the environment. So my hopes for the future, and I don't think this is unrealistic, is that actually psychological safety, mental health and safety become business as usual, and there isn't this dichotomy with physical health and safety, and that mental health really does become part of a normal everyday conversation. I also think that I really hope kind of remains is that employers continue to recognise that a culture of working in a more human, relational way that developed during the pandemic really remains. And those qualities of empathy, compassion, and inclusion are really, really kind of baked into organisational culture. And as I said before, I do think that potentially the sky's the limit for amazing possibilities of co-creating your own good job. And my hope is that everyone can genuinely thrive at work, fulfill their potential, and that national happiness and productivity soar. So I think we should stop measuring GDP and actually be looking at stuff that really matters to people, which is really their well-being and their happiness.
Yeah, let's hope we don't have to wait for the Business and the Community 2030 report. Let's hopefully 2025, we start to see some of those things picked up by businesses.
Okay, Louise, do you have some parting words of advice that you'd like to share for people who are thinking about moving into this area of workplace health and safety, psychological health and safety, sorry?
I think I really genuinely believe that this psychological health and safety is an extremely exciting area of work, you know, in terms of actually creating a common generic definition about what we mean by psychological safety. Also the challenge of how to measure it, but it's also really embedding psychological health and safety. This is really about profound organizational change. And that actually is, you know, in terms of being motivated by fewer people suffering in silence because they can't disclose a mental health issue, but just in terms of the kind of human side, in terms of happier, healthier, more engaged people, it's a really worthwhile and purposeful thing to get into, I would say.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Louise, it's been a fantastic discussion. I think our listeners could also take a lot away from your efforts. You've obviously been able to have impact without being a psychologist. I've had some recent discussions with people who have been inspired by Joelle and I so much that they're looking into a degree in organisational psychology. But you don't need to be a psychologist to have impact in this area. You really just have to have the passion and then use your skill sets and, you know, and networks and, you know, what is your base values, I guess, to make that impact. So well done.
Team up with the right people so that you've got the set of knowledge and competence across the group.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, there's definitely a role for campaigners in this, and we're glad that you're doing this important work, Louise. So where can our listeners find out more about your work and that of Business in the Community?
Yeah, well, thank you again for inviting me today. Really enjoyed our discussion. There's a whole wealth of kind of collateral on our website. Just go to www.bitc.org.uk, and if you want to drill down into wellbeing, there's a search function. But do check out our responsible business map, because, you know, I just think that in terms of sustainability, this is where this agenda is going.
Terrific. We'll make sure to put some of those links in the show notes for this podcast episode as well. So again, Louise, thank you so much for availing us of your time and being able to talk to us about this report. We hope that you'll be able to share this podcast with your network as well, and they'll find it as valuable as what we have. So look, don't forget, listeners, that you can watch these video clips if you like over Zoom. So we record them over Zoom, so you can watch them on YouTube on the Flourish DX page if you have interest. We also take the little nuggets of gold, and there were a few today again, and we post them on the Flourish DX LinkedIn page if you want to check them out. Whilst you're over on LinkedIn, throw Joelle or I a follow or connect with us. And if you want to continue the conversation, slide into our DMs. So thanks, everyone. Again, thanks to Louise, and we'll catch you next episode.